What would you like to see the Fed do, Mr. Stockman?
Why don't we go back to Carter Glass's original idea? He was the architect. He was the chairman of the banking committee in 1914. He said, this is a banker's bank. It doesn't care about unemployment or output or housing starts or anything else. Its job is to have a standby window to supply cash to the banking system.
Can we put the genie back in the bottle?
I think we should, because if we don't, the opposite of the banker's bank is monetary central planning and running the economy by 12 people, a monetary politburo, through the rough, crude instrument of interest rates, which they can't possibly accomplish.
Best article I've seen on this out of Bloomberg had all sorts of economists saying that you're off the mark. Here's somebody everybody would think would support you, and that is John Taylor of Stanford. Stanford's Taylor said he had a strong issue with the broad sweep of David Stockman's op-ed because it didn't account for great improvements in the policies and performance of the last 3 decades. Okay, folks, I hate to say, Sarah's reading Stockman cover to cover. This is the Taylor rule. This is a Dallas Fed. It's thinner, but it's got a lot of economists in it. Do you think the people in this book are off the mark?
Yeah, Taylor is a disciple of Friedman. I think Friedman was totally wrong. He was naive when he thought the Fed could sit there and steer the money supply at 3%. That is totally wrong. Taylor has a rule that's all kind of math gobbledygook that can't be implemented.
Come on, it's a linear function. There's no quadratics in it. You take it to logs. It's easy.
Right, exactly. But the point is, it assumes we can measure potential GDP, which we can't. It assumes that we're measuring prices correctly, and nobody can agree upon it. And so, therefore, it's just another method for managing the GDP. I say, don't manage the GDP. Let the private economy, let producers, consumers, investors, speculators decide what it is. It is what it is.
The government should.
You know, there is a point that we ought to learn. The government's been trying to manage GDP for the last 30 or 40 years, and increasingly, with each decade, it's failing.
But
we've got the worst performance we've ever had in the last 10 years.
I don't agree with that at all. Josh Barro, jump in here with Bloomberg View. This idea, Steve Roach talks about a third mandate. We've got to manage bubbles. Can we manage a bubble, whether it's a leveraged real estate bubble or it's a previous tech bubble?
I think we can. I think we've failed in the past in some instances. I think the middle of the last decade was definitely a failure on the part of the Fed, where they did ease too long. That is something that I agree with David on. Yeah. But I think that, you know, the question is not a perfect monetary policy. Nobody's ever had a perfect monetary policy. The question is the best available monetary policy. And I think when you look at the period before the Federal Reserve, I think you saw more bubbles.
You saw huge volatility, 1870 and 1839.
Well, that's a mythology that's basically been propagated by Keynesian scholars. It's not exactly true. Well, no, I'm taking Christina Romer, okay? I think she is not some wingnut. She studied, she's the go-to scholar, the 19th century, from 1869 to 1912. GDP grew at 3.7%, 43 years compounded, never done again in peacetime.
Variance, there was immense variance.
There were a number of panics on Wall Street. Most of them did not spill over into the GDP. Of the 5 great panics of that period, 3 of them did not even affect GDP for 1 year, did not get to Nebraska.
But David, somebody has to do something. If it's not the Federal Reserve is acting in part because nothing's coming out of Congress to help our economy.
No, well, it isn't the job of the government to make the economy work better. The government makes the economy work worse. We should be aware of that.
But when we're in crisis,
Josh,
the crisis is created by the government. How did we get the crisis of 2007 and 2008? Do you think people in America got greedy? People in America suddenly got more reckless than they'd ever been before? No. Greenspan put the interest rate to 1%. He inflated the massive housing bubble and all the rest.
Do you agree with that, Josh?
No.
I would go more to the SEC allowing leverage within the banking system, as Simon Johnson talked about.
I think there were a lot of fathers of the crisis of 2007 2008 in the public and private sector. But when you look at countries in the aftermath that have had less interventionist policies, that have not had as aggressive central banks, and that have either not had the ability or the inclination to do as much active fiscal policy,